Welcome to episode 11 of Tales from a Disappearing City, Berlin special. I'm in Berlin with my old friend Christoph Fringeli from Praxis Records. How you doing today, Christoph?
Great, yeah, all good.
Yeah.
How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. Geil. Yeah. Let's just start off like I've done with a few other people, just talking about a little bit about where you're from, as we hear the sirens of Berlin in the background, but that's fine. Where did you grow up? What was your early sort of music memories?
Yeah, I was born in Hamburg, but my parents moved to Basel in Switzerland when I was a small kid, and I grew up there, went to school and everything, and lived there till I was like 25 in the end, even though I wanted to leave a lot earlier. So my early musical experiences took place in Basel. But actually, I was not heavily into music for quite a long time, into my teens. I listened to a little bit of music and was interested in some rock and roll and protest songs and stuff like that. But I only got really into music a little bit later when friends opened up discoveries for me, when they showed me records such as Cabaret Voltaire and did that kind of electronic music or mix of electronic music and instruments was really what triggered me to get like really into it. And soon after, as soon as I discovered music for real, I wanted to make music and started bands. And
how old were you then when you first heard stuff like Cabaret Voltaire, like you said?
Like 16, 17, more like 17. I think with 16 I discovered some like punk rock and Velvet Underground and things like that, The Clash and stuff like that. And then a little bit later, like the Cabs was more like when I was 17. And the crucial record that really like changed my perspective was the Three Mantras record, actually. That was the one that blew my mind first, and then I got all the other ones.
Is that the one that's on Rough Trade, is it? Or?
It's on Rough Trade, and it has like two super long tracks on only on the record, like one track on each side. And there's in particular one, so I don't know why it's called Three Mantras, probably to add to the mystique, I don't know. But yeah, there's these two extremely repetitive tracks that work with these rhythmic structures and like noises over on the top, and that really captivated me and fired up my imagination what could be done with music.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing with Cabaret Voltaire, I think I talked about this before in the podcast. Mm-hmm. I think they're one of them acts that they don't quite get enough recognition. As obviously you got acts like Fobbing Gristle, and stuff like that. I don't think Cabaret Voltaire quite get enough. I don't know, like praise or hype for the big, being like really early of that sort of mad electronic dance hybrid sort of sound. Mm-hmm. I mean, because they were doing stuff from 1974, weren't they? Some of the early demos are anyway.
Yeah, which came out, I think, only later, but they were active since about 74, like you say, and I think the first gigs and records were probably also maybe 76, 7, I don't know.
I don't think they had a record out in 76. I think that's a little bit too early.
No, it's true.
I think they were on the early Rough Trade, like 7 inches, I believe.
Yeah. The Do the Mussolini head kick thing, and that extended play it was called, I think, that 7-inch with 4 tracks. And yeah, so maybe there was just a relatively long bedroom phase that they had, or in their whatever studio. And before they actually went public, that's true. So maybe Fobbing Gristle was public before.
Yeah, I mean, I know they had links up and they played gigs with each other, and they obviously both aware of each other. But definitely Cabaret Voltaire were a bit more with drum machines and more the rhythmic sort of stuff. I think when Fobbing Gristle was still doing, just all the weird out sort of noise stuff.
And they published a lot of albums in the late 70s, early 80s. There was like a fairly big output, and but then of course also they tried to become more commercial as well, and tried to have like pop albums, and which kind of failed before. Then they went back into like when the acid house thing came, and they kind of reconnected with the underground. Then I don't know, but they did interesting electro and like kind of hip hop scratch stuff.
Do you know what? I mean, one of my favourites is Sensoria, which was maybe when they were trying to do a bit more, I don't know if commercial was the word, but it definitely was trying to do a bit more straight ahead dance sort of stuff. I think that's an amazing record. And again, that's one of them that for me doesn't get enough sort of praise of being ahead of the game. And they did that double pack as well, Drinking Gasoline, where it's like just real like mad sort of stripped down electronic sort of funk, like Ghost Talk and stuff like that. Do you know that one?
Yeah, I think at one point I had all these records from that period that they made, and and also also other like bands like SPK or Nocturnal Emissions or Bobney Squawk and Throbbing Crystal, obviously, Psychic TV afterwards and so on. That was all very important, but I also listened to a lot of, and that kind of stuff like led up to what I was doing later, but I also listened to a lot of post-punk guitar music and even older guitar music. There was a bit of a wave of psychedelic 60s punk rock, for example. This kind of stuff that was...
What sort of bands were you listening to from that?
There were like some obscure compilations like Chocolate Soup for Diabetics and stuff like that. I wasn't necessarily following single bands like, for example, the Seeds or the 13th Floor Elevators or stuff like that. I was like only tangentially interested in those. But that was, I just want to mention it, that there was like this kind of...
What about the post-punk stuff then? What about the post-punk sort of stuff?
Definitely a lot of, pop group and then later the On-U sound and so on, that kind of lineage, and also things like the Swell Maps and The Fall and things like that. It was like really, I also had like a circle of friends who were really into that kind of music and tended to be more into the guitar music than myself maybe, but there was a very lively exchange of listening to records together and hanging out. And
well, that's important, isn't it? Where your social group does get you into stuff. I mean, one of the threads we've had through a few of the episodes is like older brothers or stuff like that getting people into music, but sometimes it's just like your friends and your mates who you just go, oh, have you heard this? And like, I mean, I still remember someone saying, actually what I do remember is seeing a bit of graffiti on this bridge in Abbey Wood, and it just said, and this has got to be like 1980 or something like that, and it just said the Human League. And I remember going to my friend, what is that? What does that mean? What is the Human League? And he went, oh, it's a band. I was like, wow, they sound pretty crazy. And this is before they went pop and they had all the massive sort of hits. They was, and I loved the first two Human League albums. Well, I loved Dare as well, I love their pop music as well. But I just remember being like, that sounds really weird and interesting, and what a mad name for a band. Were you listening to any like Swiss bands? I mean, because and the obvious one I know is Kleenex, who had to change their name, didn't they? But
it became Lilliput.
Yeah,
a little bit. There were bands like Blue China and a little bit this kind of Swiss post-punk thing, and then later the Young Gods, and of course then also the scene I got involved with myself when I started playing in bands, and that was in about, I can't remember what the first gig was, like 85 or 86. We definitely couldn't play then, but it was fine. I hadn't learned it by, learning by doing kind of thing.
Do you remember, what was the band called?
The Flowers of Evil was the first band I played in, and then we put out a cassette release, and that's also something that a lot of bands or projects or whatever did at the time, is like this, putting out cassettes and self-publishing them and swapping them on like there was a whole network of cassette labels and distribution outlets and so on. So that was a fairly lively lively scene that also had like these overlaps of electronic music, of DIY, Dada, punk things, and guitar bands and so on.
Yeah, I really remember the tape swap scene. I mean, I guess I've still got like a big box of tapes full of things that people sent me, and I think I was even on a few little random compilations and stuff like that. And yeah, this was more just like weird sampling, found sound, electronica. It's I don't know, people. It's one of them scenes because it all existed on tape. It's hard to really document. I know there used to be an archive online, there probably still is, where someone put up like thousands of these tapes, almost like, and a few people have started putting them out on vinyl from like early 80s and stuff like that. But there's so much stuff out there that
there's probably some like really amazing stuff that is completely forgotten. I know, because there are like really interesting things that never went beyond more than, I don't know, like 100, 150 copies.
Yeah.
Many, even much less.
Yeah, even that is being ambitious, because like I know people did stuff and they were probably like 10, 20 copies of these tapes going around to a few people and copied and stuff like that. But, maybe that's for future people to dig out. A bit like some of the Northern Soul or that sort of stuff. But obviously tape decays, and like I said, I keep meaning to digitize some of the tapes I've got. I've no idea what's on some of them. That's the other thing. These tapes just have like a little weird symbol or some mad image cut out of a magazine pasted on a cassette case, and you don't know what's going to appear on it. All right, so you did a few of them tapes and stuff like that.
Yeah, I started this project label fanzine thing called Vision, and the first thing was the fanzine. And then soon after, they had like consecutive numbers, a little photocopied fanzine thing with some kind of handmade cover. Had like number 1 and then number 2 and then number 3 was a tape. And so the first couple of years of its existence.
What was in Vision number 1 then? Do you remember? Back then?
Some like a mixture of like some poetry stuff and record reviews and experimental collage things. And
okay, do you want to read us a poem from Vision number 1?
I don't have it at hand, thankfully.
Okay. I think I asked Howard to do that in the previous one. Yeah, I did some. I contributed to some quite experimental, weird poetry magazines in the 80s. That, hopefully that's lost in the history of time. So you said Vision 1 and 2 were magazines, and Vision 3 was a tape?
Yeah.
So was that music that you made, or was that through like just the scene?
Yeah, it was the Flowers of Evil.
Okay. And this was, what did the Flowers of Evil sound like? What, if you could put them as a post-punk band, or were they just...
Well, we had a 606 drum machine.
Okay.
And a guitar and bass and vocals over it, and that was about it. It was quite minimal, kind of repetitive. Just like one beat, switch on and then play.
And what were you doing on this? What was your role in the band?
I was playing the guitar. We programmed the beats together, I think, and I played the guitar and did some vocals as well.
Okay. Do we have any recordings of this? Or
no.
Okay. All right. I did see some video once of you playing live in the mid-80s in Switzerland. Remember, we found that obscure sort of channel that had some of that stuff.
Yeah. It's actually turned up again.
Was that the Flowers of Evil?
Yeah, it was the first gig after we existed for about 2 weeks or something like that.
Right, and I remember you remember what you were wearing, Christoph? Because you had a good look going.
There you could see the like 60s psychedelic punk influence as well. I had like some actual maybe 70s paisley shirt and...
Okay. All right, well, I'll see if you let me, but this is the moment where I might cut in some images of the Flowers of Evil from, 85, did you say? 86, something like that?
That was 86, 87. Yeah.
Okay, all right, so hopefully you're seeing some disturbing images of the Flowers of Evil as I speak. Yeah. Okay, so all right, so you did number 3.
I mean, in fact, we started as a trio, and then I continued as a duo with the drum machine. Yeah.
Oh, you did? Oh, no.
No, originally it was a trio. It was with a drummer, and
Yeah.
then later we were a duo. But yes, then I did some solo tape and was looking for a band to play those tracks, and then that was the beginning of a band called Fluid Mask. So, people who, it was also common for people playing in lots of different bands, you know, lots of different projects with the similar lineups with different front people and so on. So
Yeah.
that was cool, but things changed a little bit when I met Alex Bues for a band called 1617. He was also playing in other projects and stuff, and that was more like kind of noise jazz, like from, you know, like the No New York type stuff, even a bit more aggressive and full on than many of those things. It was like really amazing live sets already back in the day. And of course that's where some continuity came in, because over the decades I worked with him again later, even on Praxis, and even recently, you know, we released. We'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah. What sort of instruments was in like the noise jazz then? Like
That was drums. That drummer called, his name was Knut Remond, and a guitarist, Markus Kneubühler, and he played the guitar through like an MS-20 and other you know, effects, so it often didn't sound like a guitar at all. It was like kind of a crazy noise generation.
you can do that crazy thing on the MS-20, can't you? Where you could use audio to trigger.
You can feed audio through it or use it to trigger sounds from the MS-20,
Exactly,
or
yeah.
both at the same time.
Yeah,
And
I know. Just out of shot, just here, you've got your you know, your trusty MS-20 that you've had for years.
Yeah, since those days actually.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then Alex Bues played the saxophone and did vocals as well. That was pretty impressive. And they also had a duo, Markus and Alex, called Melks, which is more comparable to some Mark Stewart stuff, actually.
Oh, really?
It was like this kind of really, like Mark Stewart of the Veneer of Democracy starts to fade phase, the kind of like really extremely overdriven kind of hip hop beats with distortion and screaming.
Yeah,
and
I love that
stuff.
album. To me, that's
That was a big one of the next big eye openers, and after, you know, the Three Mantras, definitely already learning to cope with cowardice, but the Veneer of Democracy was then really the wow, there's like a whole other possibilities. And we kind of I joined Melks at a slightly later date, and we had like a improv project called the Electric Noise Twist, and the Melks was more like the programmed beats, and, you know, did this kind of much more electronic stuff than Fluid Mask or Flowers of Evil.
Were there releases for Melks? Or?
Yeah, there's some cassettes, and there's also I think only 2 records, 2 12 inches. One was just a beat release, which was meant for, you know, DJs to mix or to reuse, to sample and so on. It's called the Metal House Master Beats, and one was a 12-inch with like finished tracks with vocals and so on, called Mind Machine. But like that, we're already advanced almost to the end of the Vision project. You know, that was like Noise Twist was 89. We did an LP with the Electric Noise Twist, which of the Vision catalog, the 1617 record I put out there, and then the Electric Noise Twist were maybe the ones that I find stand up, you know, the test of time quite reasonably well. But yeah, that's we kind of going ahead of ourselves a little bit.
That's fine. We can go out of time a little bit, but that's fine. But because I will say one thing as well, there's a book. Well, there's a couple of books, aren't there, that cover the sort of Swiss punk new wave sort of scene from that time. Mm-hmm. Hot Love, it's called.
There's Hot Love, which is covering the punk scene from 76 to 80, so that's before my time. But it's definitely, if you can find it in an affordable price, you should buy it, because it's a really
it's incredible,
really good book for that period. And then there's one called Heute und Danach, which covers the whole 80s, and which of course the punk scene was relatively small. There weren't that many bands. There were quite a few bands. There was a scene. But compared to what then happened in the 80s, of course, it was... so I think the 80s book was somehow a bigger challenge to accomplish, but they did a good job. It's definitely also worth getting. There's a chapter also about the Vision label in there. But yeah, lots of other stuff.
Okay, so yeah, about this time as well, you said like when you start getting into music, you weren't just in Basel, were you? You left Basel and... to check out music elsewhere?
Well, I went on trips mainly to London, really. I also visited other cities in that period, but in like 84, I started going to London at least once a year, and we'd go to concerts and punk gigs and to clubs and just exploring the scene there, and to record shops. That was really always a really important thing, to go to Rough Trade and the other shops that were around, buy records you couldn't easily find in Switzerland at the time, and or go to the Portobello market and buy 7 inches and stuff like that, and always come back with some treasures.
Do you remember music you bought at that time over there, or was it all,
Well, all kinds of things, to be honest, Of course, in that period, a lot of the interesting music was coming from England. I think we were reasonably, I say we, but because they were a group of friends, and not that we made big trips together. Sometimes I would go with 1 or 2 friends, and sometimes I would go on my own, or visit friends, because of course I was meeting people in London or meeting people when they toured in Switzerland, and then made contact and then would visit them again and so on. I think we were reasonably well informed about what was coming out and what was happening. You could buy the NME in Basel at the newsagent, at the railway station, so we'd do that actually.
Yeah, I mean, at that time, NME was a useful guide, wasn't it?
Yeah,
what was
and
going
there
on.
was also Sounds, which was sometimes even better. They covered a bit more of the post-punk underground stuff, at times at least, and Melody Maker sometimes. It was all these weekly music papers in paper format, which doesn't exist anymore at all.
No, I mean, that is a nostalgia fest, when it was, you could buy Sounds, Melody Maker and NME every week, and... Yeah, they almost... I think NME was always a little bit more I don't know, what's the word to use? It was a bit more elitist, or they're, trying to... Like you said, Sounds covered loads of stuff as well, and they all had their writers. I mean, I guess it was depended on the individual writers, didn't it? For that sort of stuff. Yeah, so you did kind of know what was... at least to check out, or... Yeah,
and of course, upon arrival, we'd buy Time Out and City Limits and those magazines, which also had the listings of all the clubs and the gigs and all these things in there. So
yeah, well, City Limits is a name you don't hear, because obviously that went out of business a
really long time ago.
Yeah, that is, you are showing your age there, because most people never even heard of. Whenever I say City Limits, they're because I believe City Limits, you might know better than me, but I think they were when they formed by ex-members of Time Out or something, they had some disagreement, and then they formed off City Limits. And I think City Limits was a bit more lefty, or a bit more...
I think so. That was kind of they had some kind of... I think it was some political fallout, but I can't remember
who knows
about what that was. But they split off from Time Out and made a competing magazine for a few years.
Did you ever check ID? Was that on your radar?
Actually, yes. But then more in the later 80s and in the start of the 90s,
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. Still, funny enough.
Because I know to me, like, it was a really important magazine ID, like, just for, like, the clubs and the fashion. And if you like, I was probably more into that in the mid-'80s than I was NME. I don't know, for me, 84, 85, they were sort of, it was that sort of switch when, like, because, like, even, you know, even people like John Peel would get, like, you know, a bit of shit sometimes for playing hip-hop and stuff like that, you know, which, you know, and, you know, they'd go a bit, you know, too much on the guitar-y stuff, and then I started getting into more the dancey stuff, but yeah, anyway. What sort of bands did you see when you went over?
All kinds. We go from like to like kind of a punk festival with like GBH and Angelic Upstarts and bands like that. There was some huge lineup in the Lyceum Ballroom in '84, I think, and to bands like Sisters of Mercy or Skeletal Family and you know, the more slightly gothy kind of.
You were saying before this interview that you were protesting that you weren't a goth, Christoph. Is that right?
I definitely bought some of those records. That's for sure. If that makes me a goth, I don't know, because I wasn't going for the hairdos and.
No, I did have a goth hairdo in 1985 or 84, 85, and I did go to Batcave for a short while. Yeah. All right. So yeah, you went to some of them bands. What about clubs then? You said you were going clubs.
Yeah, like just trying out things. I can't remember that many concrete ones. Definitely Gossips was one that we'd go to.
Do you remember what was on at Gossips? Because like
there was the Hard Club, but that was a bit later. I think they played like electronic body music and Euro. Yeah. You know, electronic dance music like New Beat and stuff like that.
Yeah, because that's where the Batcave moved to. I think the Batcave was originally in just off Carnaby Street in Fubert's Place or something like that.
I don't think I ever went to the original Batcave, and to be completely honest, I can't tell you if I went to one at the Gossips, maybe one, but
no. Look, my memory of clubs from that era exactly. I mean, it was normally like I'd had, you know, a bit of cider or beers, and again, it's that sort of. Yeah, all right, so yeah. Because I mean, Gossips, that building goes back to, I think there was clubs there in the 20s or something. There's no, Yeah. Well, any other clubs that you remember then apart from Gossips?
No, it was more like the gig venues, like the Electric Ballroom, for example, in Camden. Went there quite a lot. But I would have to like dig in my flyer archive and stuff like that, which I don't have that much stuff from that period, I think. But maybe that could refresh my memory a little bit.
No, that's fine. All right, any other memories from London? I know you talked to me before about buying tapes and stuff like that.
Yeah, there were also these bootleg tapes, live tapes and stuff, which you could buy on the street in Camden, mainly, other places as well. That was always exciting because that we couldn't find in Switzerland most of the time. Of course, people were bringing things back as well and copy them again and stuff like that, but you couldn't originally find them, and you know, get like a collection of Bauhaus live shows together and things like that. Well, of course, things changed towards me wanting to move to London. So I definitely wanted to leave Switzerland for like a big city, and I was eyeing Berlin and I was eyeing London, and it just so happened that you know, West Berlin at first. It just so happened that I just got to know more people in London and eventually made the jump and moved there. But before then, quite a lot of things had still happened in Switzerland, including that I started working in the music industry, if you will. I joined a collective that was running a record store, which was like the record store that was having like all these post-punk and.
This is in Basel.
That's in Basel again. Yeah. And then, kind of as a knock-on effect of that, I started working for a distributor, which was or at least one of the two like most important independent record distributors in Switzerland at the time, called Rec, and took care of the export department for a while, and we tried to distribute like cool music in Switzerland to all the record stores and to it was mainly wholesale that was extremely interesting, of course, for me at the time, because I would like be right at the heart of the new records coming out and
yeah, you'd hear them first, and I guess you're getting a wide variety of stuff to listen to as well.
Yeah, we distributed a lot of different stuff from all over the world, from American stuff like things like SST recordings and Sub Pop, I think, at the beginning, and Touch and Go and all these labels. I haven't talked much about the American sound because that was also very influential at the time. It was just something we didn't, I didn't go to America until like 1990 or something like that. But we definitely were importing a lot, and these kind of label artists like the Bottle Surfers and Big Black and the early Sonic Youth and things like that. To like a lot of labels from UK, to labels from Belgium. There was a lot of stuff. German labels. There was a partnership with a big German independent distributor called EFA, Energie für alle, which was like one of the main indie distributors here. So it was like really getting to know the business a little bit, but still doing like cool stuff. It was
I mean, I guess where you are in Switzerland, like you said, it's you are getting this stuff from all over. You're getting like you said, you're getting stuff from Germany, you're getting stuff from Belgium as well as UK and England. I don't know, like you're probably getting an all-round sort of education in music. I mean, I was in London at the time, and I was hearing stuff from all around the world, but maybe I was more focused on the stuff that was around me, if you like. Maybe you're getting it from all over.
Yeah, of course, there were also einstürzende Neubauten and German post-punk and 80s industrial scene, which we also somehow listened to and
you said you had that choice, like London or Berlin. Did you visit Berlin in the 80s, or was that later? Was it?
No, it was a bit later actually. Yeah, it was just something that seemed fascinating and like the only other option in my mind. But yeah, like I said, I started visiting London like regularly. We'd take there was like a train from Basel around like 12:30 at night that would go through the night to Paris, where you had to change to Gare de l'Est, from Gare de l'Est to Gare du Nord, then the train to Calais, and then the ferry to Dover, then the train to London Victoria, and then at like after 14 hours you would arrive in London Victoria. And
well, that's showing commitment. Yeah,
probably going directly to the record store.
Exactly. Yeah, not sleeping all night. When you first come to London, what did you actually think? Was it like the land of milk and honey, where you're like, oh, I'm in some place, or were you just like,
Oh, I thought it was fascinating, of course, but it was obviously like a big city and with, not as boring and clean as Switzerland at the time.
Well, I think one of my memories of being in Switzerland was when someone was smoking a cigarette on the platform of the station and they were cupping the ash into their hand. Yeah, I remember that happening, and I was like, "You're not going to get this in South London." But I'm not saying that's a bad thing, good or bad. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I mean, I think as well that London's still pretty dirty. Let's be honest, but London at that time was a lot more run down.
Yeah.
There was a lot more damage still from like the war, like bomb sites, and there was a lot more squatting and that sort of stuff. I mean, again, it's a whole conversation that I've had in previous episodes, that there's still this sort of stuff going on. It hasn't all disappeared, but it was kind of different landscape in the mid-80s with alternative venues, squatted venues, being able to find a squat to maybe stay at if you did come over and that sort of stuff. Was that the sort of stuff you were seeing then or not? Or
yeah, it was definitely rough, but in a way that I mostly liked. In a way, with like I usually stayed at friends' houses or acquaintances and so on, not in like random squats. But I lived in squats later when I finally moved to London, and that was in fact a big factor that made it possible for me to move, because obviously I didn't have like capital or whatever to to just rent rent something or buy a house or something like that. I was tipped off by the squad that was available, and then that's when I was like, okay, let's go, let's do it. That was in '91 then.
Yeah, so you've always been interested in politics, like related to art, music, and culture. I mean, how's that sort of fed into stuff, as in like from when you've, well, just from early years, really?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, I was kind of interested in politics before I was seriously interested in music as a teenager. And around the time I was 14, 15, in 80, 81, there was a lot of riots and conflicts in Switzerland that had to do with the fact that there was like very little cultural spaces for the young generation, let's say. And it kind of was triggered in Zurich by the fact that the Opera House got like a huge multi-million credit to pump into the serious cultural thing, and people were like protesting that and demanded autonomous youth centers, and that spread to other cities. So also not just a Swiss phenomenon. There were like big squatting movements in that period in other cities, like in West Berlin, for example, was like a big wave of squatting in Kreuzberg and other districts around then. And also there were, the riots in London and in England in the early 80s. So there was something in the air in general, but specifically in Switzerland, there was this thing about the autonomous youth centers, and it was like two years of quite, often there were like riots and buildings were squatted and then evicted and then tolerated again sometimes for some periods, and then there were problematic issues, like there was a lot of herring coming in into Europe, also into England at the time.
Yeah.
If you think about it
did. And also obviously Berlin as well was a major, that was going through Berlin strongly.
Yeah, and the scene kind of fell apart already in 81 by 82 for sure. And there was like a kind of a lull in these developments. Of course, there were always like, kind of active people, but as a lively movement that actually mobilized like hundreds, if not thousands of people, was kind of falling apart. And yeah, there were political groups, handing out flyers at the school gates and stuff. But
Yeah.
I never joined any of them specifically. But I started following the, radical politics stuff.
Yeah,
And
I mean, it's obviously like maybe I'm saying this from an English perspective, but obviously we hear more about Berlin and maybe France. I never really hear much about sort of radical sort of stuff in Switzerland. I know it's before your pre your era, Christoph. But does that go back 60s and 70s, same as in like the other countries, like 68 and all these sort of protests? Going off.
I mean, it was Switzerland is fairly small. It's like, but it was happening. There were like these movements at the universities. There were occupations in 68 in Zurich at least. There were demonstrations, and it's a little bit different because Switzerland was like in one way it's capitalist country, part of the West, but in another way it had like this emphasis on neutrality, and so not part of the Western bloc, let's say, which kind of had made everything a little bit a different kind of perspective on things to some degree. But it definitely had like a 68 movement there as well, at the unis and so on and beyond. There were attempts of mobilizing and organizing kind of similar to what happened in Germany and to some degree in England as well, trying to make these like radical political groups that would like more go into the factories and try to organize the working class in a revolutionary perspective and so on. And that was relatively, maybe not so successful, but it was happening, there were like these groups. And there's a long history. I mean, there was in the 20s, already, you know, there were the Communist Party and other radical groups from that period as well, and had like at least some local strongholds, even in the 20s and 30s. And of course, Switzerland was never turned fascist and didn't participate in the Second World War. So there was not much, barely any destruction, and so it has like a bit of a special kind of history. And there was people who were relatively well off, but at the same time quite conservative into the 80s. So we kind of were facing that kind of, you know, fairly solid kind of bourgeois environment.
Yeah, and like you said, like the early 80s again was one of them times where things exploded a little bit. I mean, that seems to happen every once in a while in our culture for various reasons, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that was one of them moments. Okay, so that was bubbling under, and you were sort of getting into the political stuff before you actually got into the music stuff.
Yeah, and then, but even parallel, there was another wave of occupation things later in the 80s in Basel. That was a temporary thing, but I can't remember for how long, but for a couple of years there was a venue, the Alte Stadtgärtnerei was squatted and used as a venue, and we played there as well. And there's also, and while, for example, in Bern, that was erected and turned into a relatively boring park at the end of the 80s. And around the same time, there was an occupation in Bern, which actually still exists, the place. It's not a Reithalle. Still an alternative venue, and you know. Because
obviously we talked about Basel quite a bit, but like how would like say the other cities in Switzerland compare like musically, like you said Bern or like Zurich or stuff like that? Are they all as important as each other? Or they all got different sort of styles or different sort of.
Funny enough, they had like different little scenes, you know. And there was, of course, a bit of cross-pollination, but I think it's still very localized kind of things going on. There's also Geneva, of course. There's the French-speaking part as well, which has its own kind of histtory. A lot of squatting in Geneva as well into the 90s.
Yeah, but could you differentiate between them, or is that hard to do? Like to say what what makes Zurich sort of sound or something like that, or is that just too generic?
Yeah, I can't really generalize, I think.
No, that's fine.
Zurich is by far it's the biggest city, and there was the most stuff happening, especially in the post-punk times. Later it became a bit more varied. There were also, funny enough, in smaller cities like Biel or Fribourg, there were often the venues, because they were kind of in the middle of the country, where people came from the bigger cities to see concerts and stuff. There were many things. And also often it had to do with just like individuals or small groups of people who just happened to be active for a certain amount of time, and then a lot can be done and happens, and then maybe they move away or
yeah, it's amazing how sometimes a tiny little group of people can have like a massive reaction on something.
And like I said, I never joined any of the in the strictest sense political groups. You know, often there were also like quite authoritarian Leninist kind of sects, so that's not really what interests me. But got more into these ideas of connecting counterculture and politics, and so was more influenced from relatively early on by like surrealism and Dada, and then later by and all their offshoots, and then later by the Situationist International and so on, but and other things, connected things that picked up these ideas of.
Where were you finding all this stuff out? For say Situationism, where were you find all that stuff from?
Well, that was via London actually. Then Stuart Home wrote this book, The Assault on Culture, which I came across when it came out. I think there must have been about 88, and featuring a lot of those strains in there. And then there was the big Situationist International Exhibition in the ICA, which was also in the Centre Pompidou. It was like an exhibition that traveled around, but I saw it at the ICA. So of course, like protested against by like people who thought they were really the true hardlines, post-situationists or whatever. But
well, that's like any movement, isn't it? There's always like, there's the protest of like, you're not the real ones and we're the real ones.
But these kind of things opened up, the discovery. I think actually, to give proper credit, I think it was vague.
Do you know what? That's what I was going to say. Because for me, it was Tom Vague magazine. That's where I first probably heard Situations and all that sort of stuff.
And I think that was like in the 84 edition already,
was.
The psychoterrorism manual.
No, it was, exactly. I got that as well. And I was going to mention Tom Vague because I definitely got all that stuff from it. And I think that linked me into all this sort of weird stuff like Temple of Psychic Youth. And
exactly, yeah.
I think there was a whole bit in one of the Vagues about them all travelling to Berlin, I think in like 84 or something. And
he was touring with X-Mal Deutschland and
they stayed in squats and all that sort of stuff. I remember reading that, and they were doing drugs and doing all sorts of stuff. And I just thought, that sounds really cool, going to Berlin and living this mad sort of life. So and it's like Decoder and stuff like that.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
Film
that
we did actually watch. Well, I was going to say recently, but it's probably a couple of years ago. But we watched it here, and I saw that in the 80s. Which is a classic. Is it Klaus Mayek directed it? Do you want to summarise the plot of Decoder? Do you remember what it was? It's 84, 85. Well, it's probably pretty hard to. It's got William Bowers in it. It's got Genesis PRH. It's got, who has it got in? Is it Blixer? Is it Blixer Barcode, or is it someone? No, it's
FM
Einheit.
It's FM Einheit and Christiane F. Of course.
Yeah, Christiane F, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's the post-punk supergroup. Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's like finding out how to like splice tapes and create situations by remixing the environment and so on. And I mean, I guess it's influenced by the electronic revolution by Burroughs.
Yeah.
And
Burroughs has a cameo in it. Yeah, I said Genesis PRH does a cameo. I remember his line in his voice. Like, it's like, information is like a bank. We must rob this bank. Yeah. And then it's something about, there's loads of frogs in it for some reason.
I think it's some Crowley reference.
And then they work in a burger. Or is it? I think Christiane F works in a burger shop. Does it? And they switch all the tapes with this. They switch.
The music gets replaced by this
riot frequencies, which was definitely like a Bowers sort of thing. Yeah. Anyway, all right. We're probably going off on some tangent, but it's kind of. How would you describe it? It's kind of appalling, but at the same time amazing. Decoder. It has its.
It's great.
Yeah. There we go. All right. It's great. Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah. So
and true. I mean that. The Vagues were like a kind of a connector between like it was obviously like a post-punk fanzine, I think. Initially, like a lot of Adam and the Ants and stuff like that.
Yeah, well, I know Stuart Holmes was obviously massive into Adam and the Ants, wasn't he? So I think there was a little link that Adam and the Ants, and then they turned into this. Like I said, it was a fanzine. It was almost like an annual, wasn't it? It was almost.
It became like this like big issues with Psyche TV and situation, the Boy Scouts Guide to Situationism or something like that was in there, and that was probably the first time like coming across the SI, and then like cyberpunk and they were like I knew Tom Vague at the time and was getting quite a lot of copies of Vague into Switzerland and was selling them there. And actually stayed at his house a couple of times as well on some of those visits to London. And then met Stuart through him, I think, a little bit later. But I was aware of Stuart's book that I mentioned earlier, The Assault on Culture, and Stuart was also writing some like Smile magazines. These, and they were partially as inserts in Wake, once or twice, I can't remember, and then as separate magazines, which I would go to Compendium bookshop to pick up all these things in the basement, I think they were mostly, which was a fantastic bookstore in London. We shouldn't forget the bookstores.
No, don't forget the bookstores. I mentioned this, I believe.
I think it was mentioned in one of your
I mentioned it with Neil
already.
Transpontine. Like, I remember Compendium and just, and again, I'm just so regretful that, like, when that place, you would go in the back room of Compendium and just find these amazing, like, early 70s counterculture magazines that have been there for like 30, 40 years and dusty copies of all sorts of stuff, wasn't it? Going back to the 60s, and like that was really like a home of like radical sort of publications for the last 40, sort of 50 years.
Yeah. Very, very important place.
I mean, you still visit a lot of bookstores, like, but yeah, there's a few left in London that you probably still visit quite a bit, isn't there?
Yes, I always go to Houseman's, for example, when I visit London.
Do you want to say where that is, just for those who don't know where that is?
Caledonian Road.
Yeah.
I think number 5. I can't remember.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say
It's
wrong,
more like the King's Cross end, isn't it? It's near King's Cross
and,
station.
And it's probably the best radical bookshop in London. There's also the 56A in Elephant Castle area, Crampton Street, worth visiting as well. They have a good archive of scenes there as well.
And maybe Freedom Press as well, or
Yeah. Those are definitely those 3 I always visit when I'm over. If time allows.
Yeah.
So, and pick up all the obscure papers.